The late afternoon chill of a Los Angeles winter wrapped itself around Grace Walker the moment she stepped out of the bookstore. She pulled her coat tighter more out of habit than warmth. Cold wasn't the thing making her hands tremble, fear was. A sharp, instinctive fear that rushed up her spine the instant she saw him. Brandon. He emerged from the corner like a ghost she had accidentally summoned, walking with that familiar mix of confidence and entitlement she once mistook for charm. The same tailored coat, the same purposeful stride, the same smile he used the night he broke her heart and tried to pretend it was a misunderstanding. For 3 months, she'd done everything to avoid him. She wasn't ready, not for his excuses, not for his voice, not for the way he had always made her question her own worth. Her breath quickened. No, not today. Not when she was finally beginning to feel steady again. Grace pivoted toward the cafe next to her, hoping to disappear into the crowd. But Brandon had already spotted her. Their eyes met across the crosswalk, and his smile widened, the kind of smile that said, "I still have influence over you." Her pulse spiked. She glanced around, desperate, searching for an escape that didn't require running like a startled bird. She needed a shield, something to block the conversation she felt coming like a storm. Then she saw him. A tall man stood near the cafe entrance, holding a cup of coffee in one hand, scrolling through something on his phone with the other. He wore a fitted black blazer over a charcoal sweater, simple, elegant, devastatingly well cut. The winter light caught in his light brown hair, and there was a steadiness to his posture, a quiet confidence that seemed almost out of place on the noisy sidewalk. Something about him radiated an ease that soothed her panic in an instant. Grace didn't think. She moved. His head lifted at the sound of her hurried steps, his brows lifting slightly in polite curiosity, just as she stopped in front of him, breathless. "Sir," her voice cracked. She swallowed and tried again. "Sir, would you mind pretending to be my boyfriend for a few minutes?" His expression flickered surprise. First, then amusement, then something warm and attentive. His eyes, a striking blue, studied her with a quiet intensity that made her feel both exposed and safe all at once. "Well," he said, voice smooth, with a hint of laughter beneath it. "That's one way to introduce yourself." "I'm sorry," Grace whispered quickly, feeling heat rush up her neck. "I know this is insane, and you have absolutely every right to say no. It's just my ex is right there, and he's coming toward me, and I can't." She cut herself off before panic could make her ramble into nonsense. "Please, just for a minute." The man didn't look behind her. He didn't need to. He saw the fear in her eyes, the desperation she was trying so hard to hide. And something in his gaze softened subtly, but unmistakably. He held out a hand. "I'm Charles." His smile was small but reassuring. "And apparently, I can be your boyfriend for as long as you need." Relief hit her so fast it almost made her knees buckle. She slipped her hand into his, and his fingers wrapped around hers, with a warmth she wasn't prepared for. Not possessive, not staged, just steady. Kind. "Grace," she managed. "Thank you." "Grace," he repeated, testing her name, as if committing it to memory. "Okay. What do you need me to?" "Grace." Brandon's voice sliced through the air before she could answer. Grace felt Charles gently squeeze her hand, a quiet promise not to move away. She inhaled and turned around, keeping her shoulders straight this time. Brandon stood only a few steps away, surprise tightening his features. "Wow," he said with forced casualness. "Didn't expect to run into you here." "Neither did I," Grace replied. Amazed, her voice wasn't shaking. Brandon's eyes drifted to Charles, surveying him the way a man sizes up a rival before acknowledging one. And this is... Charles didn't give her time to fumble. He stepped forward slightly, just enough that she felt protected. Not hidden, extended his free hand and said with a calm smile, "I'm her boyfriend." The words hung in the air with a confidence that made Brandon blink. "Oh," Brandon said, recovering quickly. "Grace, you didn't say you were seeing someone." "I don't owe you updates on my life," Grace answered, surprising herself with the firmness in her tone. Charles's thumb brushed the back of her hand, subtle but grounding. She didn't dare look at him, afraid she would melt right there in front of both men. Brandon cleared his throat, visibly off balance. "Right. I just thought, never mind. I just wanted to say hi." "Well, you have," Grace said. "Goodbye, Brandon." He hesitated, clearly, wanting to push the conversation further, but unable to find footing. After an awkward beat, he nodded at Charles with a tight, reluctant smile and walked away, his figure swallowed by the flow of pedestrians. Grace exhaled shakily, realizing she'd been holding her breath since the moment she saw him. "Wow," she muttered. "That was intense." "It looked like it," Charles said softly. His voice wasn't teasing now. It carried genuine concern. "You okay?" Grace nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure. Her heart was still pounding, her hand still wrapped in his. How strange that his touch, a stranger's touch, was the only thing keeping her grounded. "Thank you," she said. "Really, I didn't know what else to do." "You chose well," he said lightly. "I'm excellent under pressure." She laughed despite herself, the sound loosening the knot in her chest. But underneath the humor, something else was flowing between them, an awareness she wasn't ready to examine yet. She tried to pull her hand back, suddenly conscious of how long she'd been holding on. But Charles didn't let go immediately. Instead, he released her slowly, deliberately, as though making sure she didn't stumble emotionally the moment contact broke. And something in that gentle hesitation made her pulse flutter again. So he said, studying her face, with a softness she hadn't expected, "Do you want to tell me what exactly I just saved you from?" Grace hesitated. The truth was humiliating, and she hated how small Brandon had made her feel in the past. But Charles wasn't pushing, only offering space. "It's complicated," she finally said. "He didn't treat me well, and I'm still trying to figure out how not to feel like it was my fault." Charles's jaw tightened slightly, not in judgment, but in a quiet fury she sensed rather than saw. "That sounds like something you should never have had to deal with." His certainty, so simple, so matter-of-fact, cracked something open inside her. She looked away, afraid he would see too much. Before she could respond, the wind picked up, sweeping her hair across her cheeks. Grace tucked it behind her ear, but the motion didn't hide the warmth blooming under her skin. "I'm sorry you got dragged into that," she said, needing to break the tension. "Grace," he said, tone low and strangely earnest. "I walked into it willingly." That made her look at him. And that was her mistake. Because up close, his eyes were more than blue. They were steady, observant, almost startling in their clarity. The kind of eyes that didn't just look at you, but into you, as if they could read the tremble in your voice, the ache in your chest, the parts of you you kept hidden, even from yourself. Suddenly she felt weightless, as if the ground had shifted just a little beneath her feet. "Besides," he added softly, "you looked like you needed someone." Grace's breath hitched, not from fear this time, but from a strange, unexpected spark that felt dangerously close to hope. Someone. Not a savior, not a replacement, not a mistake. Just someone. She didn't know what to say. Not when her heart was still thudding from adrenaline, and something else she didn't dare name yet. Charles seemed to sense her overwhelm. He stepped back just enough to give her space, but not enough to create distance. His voice gentled. Tell you what, there's a cafe right here. Let me buy you a drink. No pretending, no roles. Just two strangers with a weird story to laugh about. She blinked. You want to get coffee with me? He smiled. Grace, if that performance was our first date, we deserve at least a second one that doesn't involve your ex. Her laugh came out softer this time, warmer, and before she could talk herself out of it, she nodded. Okay, coffee. They walked toward the cafe together, close enough for their shoulders to brush far enough to pretend it was accidental. But Grace knew somewhere deep in her chest that something had shifted. A stranger had stepped in to protect her. But what unsettled her more was the truth she didn't want to admit yet. It didn't feel like the end of something. It felt like the beginning. The cafe door closed behind them with a soft chime, sealing out the noise of the street and replacing it with the warm hum of espresso machines and low conversation. Grace felt her heartbeat slipping back into a steadier rhythm, though her hand still tingled where Charles had held it minutes earlier. She wasn't sure if the sensation was a ghost of panic or something entirely different. The air inside carried the comforting scent of roasted coffee beans and faint vanilla. Yet she sensed a strange electricity threading between her and the man walking beside her, subtle but unmistakable like static, before a storm that hadn't decided whether to break or pass quietly overhead. Charles guided her toward a small table near the window, not quite touching her, but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. He moved with such calm assurance, it unsettled her in the softest way, graceful but not performative, confident but never imposing. It was the kind of presence that made people look twice, without knowing why. Grace sat down, exhaling slowly, trying to collect herself. She could still see the street outside the stream of cars, reflecting the gold of the setting sun, the silhouettes of pedestrians she no longer had to fear. She tried to anchor herself in the ordinary details, the grain of the wooden table, the clink of cups behind the bar, the faint scratch of a pen from someone writing in a corner. Ordinary should have steadied her, but nothing about the moment felt ordinary. Charles returned with 2 drinks black coffee for him, vanilla oat latte for her, setting hers in front of her without a word. She blinked, surprised. How did you? He smiled, just a small lift of the lips that made his eyes soften. You looked like someone who prefers something warm and calming, but not too bitter. Was I wrong? She hesitated, fingers brushing the warm cardboard sleeve. No, not wrong at all. Something fluttered in her stomach, fragile and unsettling. She wasn't used to being read this quickly. Brandon had never noticed anything she liked unless it benefited him. The contrast was sharp enough to sting. She wrapped both hands around the cup, partly for warmth, partly to steady herself. Thank you, she murmured. You don't have to thank me, Charles said quietly. You looked like you needed something gentle. Her breath faltered, not dramatically, just enough that she felt it. Gentle. She didn't remember the last time someone had tried to give her gentleness instead of explanations, suspicions, or demands. She took a cautious sip, letting the warmth settle somewhere deep in her chest. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was different from the one outside. It wasn't tense. It wasn't forced. It felt like an invitation, one she wasn't sure how to accept, without giving away pieces of herself she usually kept guarded. Eventually, Charles leaned back slightly, studying her with an openness she found both comforting and disarming. Do you want to talk about him? He asked, not pushing, just offering. Grace's pulse flickered uneasily. Part of her wanted to pretend she didn't care, to claim the encounter hadn't shaken her, but she could still feel the way her stomach had twisted when Brandon smiled at her. She hated the power he still held in the shadows of her mind. It's not a story I like telling, she admitted softly. There's not much to it anyway. He cheated, lied, tried to make me feel like it wasn't a big deal. And I I let him make me feel small for too long. Charles's jaw flexed, barely visible, like he was holding back a visceral reaction, but his voice remained gentle. I'm sorry he did that to you. Grace looked down at her cup. I used to think I was over it, but seeing him today, I felt like I was shrinking all over again, like he could pull me back into that version of myself just by looking at me. You didn't shrink, Charles said firmly. You stood your ground. Even if you needed someone next to you, you didn't let him define how you spoke or held yourself. Grace forced a small smile. Maybe, or maybe I only appeared brave because you were there. His eyes softened. Everyone needs someone sometimes. That doesn't make you weak. She swallowed, unable to respond immediately. In the past, needing anyone had been a vulnerability Brandon used as leverage. Hearing someone say it wasn't shameful felt almost foreign. Grace shifted her gaze toward the window, watching the city blur softly as the sky deepened into a dusky violet. I hate that he still gets to me, she whispered. Pain doesn't disappear on command, Charles replied, but it changes shape. You're not trying to get him back. You're trying to get yourself back. She stared at him, startled by the accuracy of the words. How do you know that? Because he said softly, you ran to a stranger instead of letting him pull you into a conversation you weren't ready for. That's self-protection, not weakness. Something warm pressed against her ribs at that relief, mixed with an unfamiliar spark of admiration. She didn't want to rely on a stranger for validation, and yet here she was, feeling more seen than she had in years. Charles. She began, not sure where she wanted the sentence to go, but the weight of the day had begun settling over her shoulders, heavy with confusion and unspoken questions. Why did you help me? Really? He didn't look away. Because you looked terrified. And no one should stand alone when they look like that. But you didn't even know me. Maybe that's why it mattered. The words sank into her slowly, like ink spreading through water. She set her cup down, fingers tracing the rim absently. She should have been grateful, and nothing more. He owed her nothing. She owed him nothing. Yet the moment she'd taken his hand felt like a pivot in her life, small, unexpected, impossible to undo. And there it was again, that delicate shift under her skin, like the moment right before a truth you're not ready to understand. She pulled a breath in through her nose, steadying herself. This feels strange, she admitted. Not bad, strange, just unexpected. His lips curved in a soft, wry smile. It feels unexpected to me, too. She studied him for a long moment, noticing details she hadn't allowed herself to observe earlier. The faint shadow of stubble along his jaw, the tiny crease near his left eye when he smiled, the way he kept his hands relaxed on the table, as if he didn't want to risk intimidating her. He was handsome in a way that didn't demand attention, but commanded it all the same. And yet something else lingered beneath the polished exterior, an undercurrent of fatigue or tension he carried so quietly she might have missed it entirely if she weren't looking closely. She frowned slightly. You seem tired. His brows lifted, amused. Is that your polite way of saying I look terrible? No, she said, a hint of a smile spreading despite herself. Just tired. You hide it well, but it's there. He hesitated, fingers brushing the handle of his cup as if considering how much to reveal. It's been a long week, he admitted finally. A lot on my mind. Work, she guessed. His pause was barely perceptible. Something like that. Grace felt a faint tug of curiosity. Something in his tone suggested a truth he wasn't saying, something layered and heavy. But she didn't push. She had no right, not after what he'd just done for her. Still, she couldn't shake the sense that he was holding a weight far heavier than he let on. Before she could ask more, he leaned forward slightly, elbows resting lightly on the table. Let me ask you something, Grace. When you ran toward me, his voice grew quieter. the question almost hesitant. Was I really the first person you saw, or did I look safe? Grace blinked, surprised by the vulnerability in his tone. She searched his face, unsure whether he was teasing or genuinely curious. But the sincerity in his gaze gave her the answer. "I saw you," she said softly. "And I felt like you wouldn't let me fall apart alone." His breath caught, barely noticeable, but she felt it. His expression shifted, something subtle, almost tender, like her words had touched a place he kept hidden. "I'm glad," he murmured. A moment passed, quiet, charged, suspended. And in that fragile space, Grace felt a subtle shift inside her, equal parts fear and possibility. But then, like a faint crack running through a flawless surface, a thought intruded, sharp, unwelcome. Why did he feel safe? Why him? Why instant trust toward a stranger? Her heart tightened. Was it intuition? Or something she couldn't name yet? She looked at him again, really looked, and a strange unease flickered beneath her ribs. Not about him, but about how quickly the connection had formed. It scared her in ways she didn't want to admit. As if sensing the shift in her posture, Charles tilted his head slightly. "You just went somewhere in your mind," he said quietly. "Where did you go?" Grace swallowed. "I'm not sure." "That sounds like a lie," he said softly, without judgment. She let out a slow, shaky breath. "It scares me how easy it was to trust you." This time the crack rippled across his expression, faint and fleeting. "I know," he said. "It scares me too." The honesty in his words sent a nervous warmth rushing up her spine, a feeling dangerously close to anticipation. But before she could make sense of it, before she could ask what exactly scared him, something flashed behind his eyes, a flicker of hesitation, like he'd remembered something he shouldn't forget. Then, almost too quickly, he straightened. "Grace, there's something I should—" His phone buzzed sharply on the table, the intrusive vibration cutting through the fragile moment like a blade. He glanced at the screen, and in an instant, his whole demeanor shifted, his jaw, tightening, his posture, sharpening into something more guarded, more controlled, more distant. The warmth between them thinned, replaced by a tension she didn't understand. "Is everything okay?" she asked. He locked the phone without answering the call. "It will be," he said, but the tightness in his voice betrayed a different truth. "What's wrong?" she pressed gently. Charles exhaled slowly, eyes flicking from her to the darkened phone. When he finally met her gaze again, there was a gravity there she hadn't seen before, a shadow behind the blue. "Grace," he said softly, "I need to tell you something. But not here." Her pulse skipped. "Why not?" His eyes softened, almost apologetic. "Because once I tell you, everything between us will shift. And I'm not ready to lose this moment yet." A chill that wasn't from winter slid down her spine. A promise, a warning, a crack in the surface of the stranger who felt safe. And Grace, heart unsteady, realized something unsettling. Whatever he was carrying wasn't small, and whatever he was about to reveal could change everything. Grace didn't fully remember leaving the cafe, only the strange heaviness in Charles's last sentence, and the way it seemed to echo in her chest long after they stepped back into the cool Los Angeles evening. The sky had deepened to a muted indigo, and the streetlights glowed softly on the damp pavement, reflecting the city in ghostly smears of gold and blue. She walked beside him in silence, not because she didn't have questions. She had too many, sharp and urgent, but because something in his expression made her hold them back. He looked like a man balancing on a ledge, trying not to fall, and she sensed that one ill-timed word from her would push him off balance. She wasn't ready for whatever truth he carried, but she realized she feared something more, that if he spoke it now, he might turn away from her afterward. They moved together through the slow flow of pedestrians, close enough that she could feel his presence like a quiet pulse, but not touching. Earlier, the closeness had wrapped around her like warmth. Now it vibrated with tension she didn't know how to interpret. She kept her eyes ahead, but her thoughts circled around him relentlessly. Who was he beyond that gentle smile and steady voice? What kind of truth required privacy and carried the weight of possible loss? And why did she care so much when she had known him barely an hour? That last question struck her hardest. It wasn't reasonable. It wasn't rational. Yet caring was undeniable. She felt it in every breath, in the quick stutter of her heartbeat, whenever he turned his head even slightly toward her. Something about him made her want to lean in, to trust, to soften, and that terrified her more than Brandon's sudden reappearance ever could. When Charles finally spoke, his voice was quieter than the city around them, almost as if he feared it might break if he used it too loudly. He said her name not as a question or warning, but as a tether pulling her attention fully to him. She glanced up, and in the lamplight, he looked conflicted, as if the war inside him was becoming harder to hide. He took a long breath, the kind one takes before stepping into cold water. "I don't want to frighten you," he murmured, his gaze steady but shadowed. And yet, despite the softness of his tone, Grace felt her stomach tighten, bracing. Something about his restraint, his careful choice of words, the slight hollowness beneath them, sent a chill through her. A part of her wanted to tell him she wasn't afraid, that she could handle whatever truth he was preparing to give her. But that would have been a lie, and she suspected he would hear it immediately. So instead, she said nothing, waiting. Charles halted at this corner of the block, stepping a little away from the passing crowds until they were half hidden in the spill of light from a closed boutique. His eyes stayed on hers, searching as though he needed silent permission to continue. She gave a small nod, and something inside him loosened, though it only made his next words more fragile. He admitted that the phone call had been urgent, more urgent than he'd wanted to show. Someone needed him, someone who didn't take no for an answer. No names, no details, only the acknowledgement that the call came from a world he had tried to step away from, for the brief, impossible hour he'd spent with her. Grace watched the struggle on his face, the flicker of obligation, pushing against desire, and it clicked. Whatever he was hiding wasn't something he feared she would judge. It was something he feared would change how he existed with her. And the realization made her chest ache unexpectedly. But before she could ask anything, a dark-colored SUV pulled up to the curb beside them, windows tinted, engine too smooth for its size. The door opened before the driver stepped out, a tall man with a rigid posture and an expression carved from something colder than stone. His eyes went straight to Charles, ignoring Grace, entirely speaking his name in a controlled, low voice that carried authority like a badge. Charles's reaction was immediate, not fearful, but weary, as if this interruption had been inevitable. Grace's heart thudded painfully. She didn't know why she felt suddenly excluded, as if the world Charles lived in had caught up with him and was reminding her she didn't belong there. The man addressed Charles again, this time with a tone that implied both urgency and reprimand. And although Grace didn't understand the content, she understood the implication. Charles had responsibilities he was expected to answer to, and being here with her had already stretched someone's patience. When Charles finally spoke back, his voice was clipped, formal, so different from the warmth he'd shown her. The contrast sent a small tremor through Grace's chest. She watched them trade, a few terse sentences too soft for her to hear, and the unease inside her grew. She hated how familiar it felt, how quickly a man could switch tones depending on his audience. But no, she told herself quickly, this wasn't Brandon. This wasn't manipulation. This was something else entirely, something bigger than pride or ego. When Charles turned back to her, the careful vulnerability she'd seen earlier had returned softened by something nearly apologetic. "I'm sorry," he said. "I have to go for a little while." A small, sharp disappointment pierced her ribcage. "Is everything okay?" He hesitated too long for comfort before giving the smallest nod. "It will be." That phrase again. Not now, not yet, but eventually. Grace searched his face for more, for anything that might offer clarity, but his expression held only sincerity and a quiet regret, as though he wished he could stay, but something beyond his control was pulling him away. She wasn't accustomed to this feeling, to being left with half-truths and unfinished threads. With Brandon, every unanswered question had been a trap. With Charles, the unknown felt different, but no less unsettling. She forced her voice to remain steady. "Do you need me to do anything?" "Just wait," he murmured. The words slipped out before he could temper them, and she felt them land inside her like a tentative invitation, one she wasn't sure she should accept. He seemed to realize the weight of what he'd said, because he added softly, "Only if you want to." She nodded once, not trusting herself to speak. His gaze lingered on her, as if he wanted to memorize the moment before stepping back into the SUV. But then something strange happened before he entered. He reached out his fingers, brushing her hand in the gentlest, most hesitant contact, less a touch and more a question. Her breath caught, and he seemed to feel it, his thumb grazing her knuckles with an intimacy so careful it almost broke her. Then he stepped away. The door shut. The SUV pulled into traffic, and Grace remained on the sidewalk, watching the taillights disappear into the glowing river of Los Angeles twilight. When the last glimmer vanished, she exhaled shakily, realizing how cold the air had become. Her hand still tingled where he'd touched it. She tried to ground herself in logic. This was a stranger she barely knew, someone who clearly came from a life complicated enough to require security staff and urgent summons. She shouldn't be affected by this. She shouldn't care enough for her chest to feel hollow. But no amount of logic could hide the truth. She had felt something with him, something frighteningly close to possibility. And now she was standing alone in a quiet pocket of the city, as the night pressed around her, like a reminder of how quickly hope could slip away. She wrapped her arms around herself and began walking not toward home, but where her feet naturally carried her back toward the bookstore. She wasn't ready to sit in her silent apartment with her thoughts. She needed someplace familiar, someplace rooted in who she was, before Charles's gaze had softened parts of her she thought had hardened for good. Along the way, her mind replayed every tiny shift in his expression. The warmth when he'd said her name, the tension when he'd looked at his phone, the shadow in his eyes when the man in the SUV appeared. There were layers to him she hadn't seen yet, layers she couldn't name, but deeply sensed. And beneath them all was the fear she couldn't shake, that his truth, whatever it was, might be something she wasn't prepared to handle. But another thought surfaced, just as quickly, soft, yet unsettling. What if the truth wasn't what she should fear? What if the real danger was how quickly she was beginning to want answers? Because she already cared who he was beneath the surface. She reached the bookstore, unlocked the door with a trembling hand, stepped inside, and let the familiarity settle around her. But for the first time, the place felt too quiet, too small, too far from the world she'd glimpsed through Charles's eyes. And as she stood there in the dimness, one realization pressed against her ribs like a secret knocking for attention. Something had shifted tonight, not just in him, but in her. And whatever came next would not let either of them remain the same. Grace had told herself all afternoon not to go, not to give in to whatever fragile thread had begun weaving itself between them. But as dusk settled over Los Angeles, with its bruised purple sky and soft gold haze, her resolve unraveled, just enough for her to find herself walking toward the place Charles had asked her to meet him. Her steps were slow, hesitant, almost reluctant, yet every part of her knew she would not have stayed away, even if she'd tried. Something about the way he'd looked at her before leaving the quiet apology, wrapped in longing. The fear he didn't quite hide had lodged itself deep inside her, tugging at her with a pull she couldn't explain. When she reached the base of the private road, she paused, staring up at the long, winding hill that led toward the estate. The city glimmered behind her like a familiar safety net, but the path ahead felt like stepping into the unknown. She had never belonged to a world built on secrecy, polished surfaces, or guarded truths. Her world was paperbacks, cramped apartments, the smell of old pages, the chatter of customers looking for escape in stories. And yet tonight, she was walking toward a story she didn't know how to read, much less control. The iron gates slid open with a soft, mechanical sigh, as if they had already memorized her presence. Grace's heart thudded painfully as she stepped inside, feeling swallowed by manicured grounds and shadows cast by towering trees lining the driveway. Charles's home, or whatever this place was, loomed ahead, a modern masterpiece of glass and clean lines, glowing from within like a lantern in the darkness. It was beautiful in a cold, breathtaking way, the kind of beauty that felt almost untouchable. She hesitated at the front steps, doubting herself, doubting why she was here at all. But then the door opened, and Charles stood framed in the soft interior light, watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. Not pride, not arrogance, not the guarded calm he wore earlier, but something rawer, relief, as if he hadn't been sure she would come. He stepped back silently to let her inside, and she crossed the threshold, feeling as if she'd entered a parallel version of Los Angeles, where everything was too refined, too silent, too deliberate. The air smelled faintly of cedar and something darker, like aged bourbon, lingering in the walls. She followed him into a wide living room, where floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the glittering city, below each light blinking like a heartbeat. The view should have stolen her breath, but her attention remained fixed on him. His shoulders were tense, his usually calm posture pulled tight as if bracing for impact. She wondered how someone who moved through the world with such natural confidence could look this uncertain in his own home. 1,000 questions rose in her throat, but none felt right. She didn't want to interrogate him, didn't want to make him retreat behind whatever walls he'd built around his life. Instead, she whispered the only truth she could offer. "I wasn't sure I'd come." He swallowed, nodding as if he'd expected that. "I wasn't sure you would either." There was a flicker of vulnerability in his voice that made her chest twist, and suddenly she realized he wasn't just nervous, he was afraid. Of her reaction, of what tonight might change, of losing something that had barely begun. He gestured for her to sit, but she stayed standing because something about sinking into his expensive furniture felt like surrendering to a world she didn't trust yet. He seemed to understand, stopping a few feet away, giving her space in a way that made her both grateful and unbearably aware of him. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, with a breath that trembled just slightly, Charles began. Not in the rehearsed, polished tone she had expected from someone who clearly lived in a world of boardrooms and expectations, but in a low, almost shaky voice that sounded like he had spent hours debating whether to speak at all. He told her about the pressure, how every decision he made was measured, scrutinized, weighed against his family's legacy, how his life wasn't truly his, not in any way that mattered. He talked about responsibilities handed to him instead of chosen, about expectations he felt suffocated by, about the constant presence of people needing him, controlling him, deciding things before he could. He confessed things he'd never told strangers, things that made Grace feel like she was holding a delicate piece of his soul. But beneath all of it, She sensed something he wasn't saying, something heavier than what his words carried. She stepped closer without meaning to, drawn forward by instinct. "Charles," she murmured, "there's more, isn't there?" He looked at her with a startled softness, and in that moment, she could almost see the truth flickering behind his eyes, the fear of being truly known. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he nodded. And then came the shift, the moment the air changed and the real weight of the night settled between them. He confessed that the man in the SUV wasn't just an employee, not merely security or a driver. He was someone who answered to another force within Charles's world, someone tied to his father, who monitored him more than protected him. Someone sent tonight not to escort him, but to retrieve him. Grace felt a chill crawl up her spine. "Retrieve you?" She echoed, her voice thin. He gave a quiet, humorless laugh. "In my family, freedom is conditional. Every hour I spend outside of my expected schedule is questioned." She stared at him, the magnitude sinking in slowly, painfully. She had known he came from wealth, maybe influence, but she hadn't imagined chains like these chains that looked like marble floors and luxury cars, but felt no less binding. And suddenly her heart ached for him, in a way she hadn't prepared for. But before she could speak, before she could comfort or understand, Charles said something that made her breath stop entirely. "Grace, they know about you." The words hung in the air like a dropped match, tiny but powerful enough to ignite everything around them. She blinked, stunned. "What do you mean they know about me?" He ran a hand through his hair, turning slightly away, as if facing her, made the confession harder. "They track where I go, who I meet, how long I'm gone. Tonight they saw us together." The room tilted slightly in her vision, reality bending under the weight of implications she didn't want to face. She had walked into his world thinking she was just visiting the home of a complicated man, not stepping onto the radar of a powerful family she knew nothing about. "Why does it matter that they saw us?" she whispered. He met her eyes then, and the fear in his expression was no longer hidden. "Because they will have questions. Because they will draw conclusions. Because in my family, nothing is ever casual." Her pulse hammered a mix of confusion, fear, and something sharper, something like betrayal. Though she knew he hadn't lied, he had simply never imagined things would escalate this quickly. "I didn't ask for this," she said softly, her voice cracking. "I just needed to hide from my past for a moment. I didn't mean to walk into yours." Charles flinched as if she'd struck him. "I know, and I'm so sorry." She wanted to be angry, but the emotion that rose instead was heartbreak. Not over his world or its consequences, but over the fact that she had begun caring about someone whose life might consume hers if she wasn't careful. She turned toward the window, needing distance from the intensity of his gaze. The city sprawled below them, like an ocean of glitter, vast and indifferent, reminding her how small she was compared to the forces pressing in on him. On them. She placed a hand against the cold glass to steady herself. Behind her, Charles took a hesitant step forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Grace, I didn't want you dragged into this. I only—" He stopped, breath faltering. "You were the first moment of calm I've had in years. I didn't want to lose that. Lose you." The confession cracked something inside her. Not the fragile parts, but the parts she tried so hard to keep protected. She turned back to him, her voice trembling with truths she didn't want to admit. "I don't know if I can survive your world." His face softened, full of something tender and helpless. "I don't know if I can survive it without you." And in that impossible, terrifying moment, Grace felt the ground shift beneath them both. Her fear, his longing, their two worlds colliding, not in disaster, not yet, but in a question that neither of them knew how to answer. A question she felt living in her pulse, in her breath, in the silence stretching between them. Was this the beginning of something worth fighting for? Or the start of a storm they might not survive? Grace didn't remember moving, but suddenly she was standing farther from Charles than she'd been since the night they met, as if her body needed distance to comprehend the enormity of what he had just confessed. And the moment she stepped back, the room seemed to change, the air tightening with a pressure she hadn't noticed until then, like the vast house itself was waiting for her reaction, listening for the smallest shift in her breath. She felt weight gathering in her chest, a slow ache spreading as she looked at him. This man who had held her hand with such gentleness, who had kissed her like she was something rare, who had given her glimpses of vulnerability. She doubted he'd shown anyone else, and yet behind everything, he was behind everything. He'd offered her. There was now a shadow. She couldn't ignore a force she didn't understand, but could already feel circling her life like a tightening ring. Charles didn't move, didn't try to reach for her, and somehow that restraint made her chest twist even more, because she could see the war happening inside him, the way his muscles tensed, as if his body begged him to step forward, but fear or guilt held him in place. His family knew about her. That sentence echoed in her mind with a cold persistence, because it wasn't just knowing. It was the implication beneath it, the kind of knowledge born from surveillance, expectation, ownership. She pressed her fingers to her temples, breathing in slowly, trying to settle the trembling that had begun spreading through her hands. She was used to simple fears: overdue bills, unexpected loneliness, losing herself in a relationship like she had with Brandon. But this was something else entirely, something disproportionate to her small life as a bookstore clerk, something that felt too big, too dangerous, too far outside anything she had ever imagined. She turned toward the glass wall again, because facing the city felt easier than facing the intensity of Charles's eyes. Los Angeles glittered below a beautiful sprawl of lights, but instead of comfort, Grace felt a sudden distance from everything she'd known. It struck her that somewhere out there, her life waited with its quiet routines and modest comforts, a life where no one tracked her movements or assigned meaning to her existence. A life she had once thought too small, but now felt like a sanctuary she had stepped away from without realizing how precious it was. Behind her, she heard Charles exhale shakily, the sound like someone bracing against the cold. "Grace," he began, his voice hoarse with emotion he could no longer mask. "I never wanted you to feel threatened. I didn't want my world touching yours like this." She closed her eyes because the sincerity in his voice was painful, almost too much to bear. "But it has," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper, yet sharp enough to carve through the space between them. "And you knew it could." The silence that followed felt like a held breath. She turned back to him slowly, studying him with a new awareness. The weight of responsibility etched in the tension of his jaw, the exhaustion in his posture, the fear that flickered in his eyes, not for himself, but for her. For the first time, the difference between vulnerability and danger became startlingly clear. Grace had always prided herself on understanding people, on sensing motives behind words, on reading emotions like she read the endings of old novels. But Charles was a story she wasn't sure she had the courage to finish. He stepped closer, just a few inches, enough for her to feel the gravity of him, without closing the distance entirely. "I can protect you," he said softly, voice steadying in determination. She searched his face, her heartbeat uneven. "Can you?" He flinched, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough for her to see the truth hidden in the small flicker of his gaze. He didn't know if he could. She took a slow breath, her voice trembling but controlled. "Charles, I'm not afraid of you. I'm afraid of everything around you." His expression tightened, and for the first time she saw something close to despair flash in his eyes, a brief crack in the man who had always seemed composed, even in vulnerability. "I know," he said quietly, "and that's what terrifies me the most." He ran a hand over his face, pacing a short distance away, before turning back toward her, as if unable to stand being farther than a few steps from her. "My father is a man who sees relationships as strategies, people as assets, attachments as liabilities. If he thinks you're important to me—" His voice broke, and Grace felt a chilling ripple sweep through her. "He will interfere." The words settled over her like a cold weight. Interfere. That could mean anything in families built on power, pressure, manipulation, control, threats, disguised as opportunities. She swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice steady. "So he'll try to keep you away from me." The muscle in Charles's jaw clenched. "Yes, and you'll let him?" she asked quietly, not as an accusation, but as a genuine fear she needed to voice. He looked as if she had struck him. "Grace, no," he said immediately, stepping forward before he could stop himself. "I can't. Won't let that happen. I didn't realize until last night how far he'd go, how quickly he'd move. But I'm not going to let anyone decide who I care about." She held his gaze, searching for the conviction beneath his words. She found it burning raw, almost reckless. But conviction was not the same as power. She wasn't naive enough to blur the lines. "And what about me?" she whispered. "Do I get a choice in being pulled into your life this way?" He closed the last few inches between them, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel the strain in him, the longing, the guilt. "Yes," he breathed. "You always have a choice." She waited, expecting him to reach for her, but he didn't. And she realized he was giving her something far more difficult than affection. He was giving her space to walk away. And the possibility of that hurt him more than he wanted her to see. For a moment, neither of them moved, suspended in a fragile balance where any decision could shatter what they'd begun building. Grace's heart thudded painfully. "Tell me what happens next," she said finally. Charles inhaled slowly, eyes darkening with truth he had held back until now. "Next," he said, "my father will want to meet you." Her blood chilled. "Why?" "Because he wants to know anything that matters to me," he said, voice heavy, "so he can control it, or eliminate the threat it poses." Grace's breath hitched, the words hitting her harder than she expected. She felt something crumble inside her, a quiet, devastating fear that maybe she truly wasn't built for a life where affection came with consequences and being loved meant being watched. But then Charles's expression shifted, something fierce, almost defiant, flickering across his face, and he stepped closer, his voice low and steady. But this time he whispered, "He won't get to decide." She looked up at him, her own fear mirrored by something stronger, the painful, undeniable truth that she cared for him too deeply to pretend otherwise. That maybe she had felt something real the moment she grabbed his hand on that sidewalk, long before she realized what it could cost. Her voice trembled. "And what if I'm not strong enough for this?" His eyes softened, and for the first time since she'd arrived, hope, not fear, rose in his voice. "Then I'll be strong enough for both of us until you are." Grace felt her defenses waver, felt the cold fear in her chest melt just slightly because he wasn't promising perfection, wasn't pretending he could fix everything. He was just offering himself, flawed and terrified and desperately trying. She stepped closer without thinking, drawn toward him in a quiet surrender. She wasn't sure she fully understood. "This isn't fair," she whispered. "I didn't choose any of it." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, but she didn't, and when his fingers brushed her cheek, The touch felt like a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "I know," he murmured, "but I choose you, even if it complicates everything." Her voice broke. "And if I choose you," his breath hitched at the unspoken possibility. "Then we'll face whatever comes," he said softly together. And in that suspended moment, city lights glowing behind them, fear and longing twisting together in their chests, Grace realized this was the turning point. Not safety, not certainty, but the quiet, terrifying decision to risk her heart in a world that had the power to break it. And yet, as Charles's forehead rested gently against hers, she felt something steady rise inside her, something that whispered that sometimes the greatest courage wasn't running away from the unknown, but stepping into it with someone who was just as afraid of losing you. Grace didn't sleep that night. She lay awake in her small apartment listening to the hum of distant traffic replaying every word Charles had spoken, every shadow that flickered in his eyes, every tremor of fear she tried to pretend she didn't notice. And by dawn, she felt as if she were suspended between two worlds, one familiar, one utterly foreign, and she didn't know where she belonged anymore. When her alarm buzzed, she silenced it without moving, staring at the ceiling with a heaviness in her chest she couldn't shake because part of her wanted to run from everything Charles represented, from the family that watched him like a commodity, from the threat of being evaluated, judged or rejected by people who wielded power, so naturally they didn't even recognize it as power. But another part of her, the part that remembered the feel of his forehead resting against hers, the tremor in his breath when he whispered, he chose her, refused to let fear be her compass. She arrived at the bookstore early, hoping the quiet aisles and familiar scent of old paper would steady her thoughts. But the moment she stepped inside, she felt the tension she'd tried to outrun snap back into place like a rubber band. She reorganized shelves that didn't need reorganizing, wiped clean tables that were already spotless, anything to keep her hands from trembling. But her thoughts kept circling back to Charles's warning. His father would want to meet her. Not out of curiosity, not out of kindness, out of calculation. The idea of being evaluated like some variable in a business model made her stomach twist, but she tried to breathe through it, telling herself the meeting wasn't happening today, that maybe Charles would find a way to delay everything, soften the blow, protect her from the dark corners of his world. But life had a way of ignoring hopes, especially fragile ones. Around noon, the bell above the door chimed, and Grace looked up expecting a customer, maybe someone looking for a romance novel to escape into someone she would envy for having the freedom to lose themselves in fiction. But the man who stepped inside wasn't holding curiosity in his eyes. He carried something colder, heavier. He wore a suit cut so precisely, it seemed sharper than the expression on his face, and his posture radiated an authority that didn't need to announce itself. His hair was silver at the temples, his jaw firm, his presence so commanding that the room felt smaller the moment he entered. Grace stiffened instantly because she didn't need an introduction to know exactly who he was. Charles's father, Whitmore Sr., the storm behind the glass. He scanned the room with an expert's eye, the kind of gaze that skipped sentiment entirely, assessing structure, utility, relevance. When his eyes landed on her, something unreadable flickered through them. He approached slowly, not with threatening aggression, but with the smooth assurance of a man who had never needed to chase anything in his life. Things simply moved out of his way. "Grace Walker," he said in a low, composed voice that carried the weight of too many decisions. Not a question, a statement, a fact he had confirmed before even stepping foot in her space. Her throat tightened. "Mr. Whitmore," she managed, though the words felt thin and fragile against the quiet command in his tone. He glanced around the shop once more, as if cataloging its modest charm. The soft disarray of books, the handwritten staff recommendations taped beside shelves. "I can see why Charles found this place refreshing," he said, though his tone made it unclear whether refreshing was praise or a polite insult. Grace braced herself, gripping the edge of the counter to steady her voice. "If you're here because of... I'm here," he cut in calmly. "Because my son is... distracted." The word stung sharp and surgical. "And distraction," he continued, "is a luxury people in our position cannot afford." Grace's heart pounded, but she forced herself to meet his gaze, even though the pressure of his presence made her feel small in ways she hated. "Charles isn't an object to be managed," she said quietly. Something shifted in Whitmore's expression. Not shock, not offense, but a faint flicker of interest, as though her defiance was a puzzle he hadn't expected. "My son," he said, "was raised to lead an empire. His decisions carry weight far beyond personal preference. I am not here to intimidate you, Ms. Walker. I am here because I need to understand whether you comprehend the implications of your involvement." Involvement. As if she were some variable in an equation destabilizing his balance sheet. Grace swallowed hard, feeling the tremor beneath her ribs intensify. "With all due respect, sir, this isn't your decision." His eyes hardened, but only slightly, like steel cooling instead of cracking. "Everything that touches my son's future," he replied, "is my concern." And that was when Grace felt anger rise slow and hot, cutting through the fear that had been suffocating her since last night. "I'm not a threat," she said, voice steadying. "I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't go looking for influence or attention. I met your son by accident." "There are no accidents in our world," he replied. "Only consequences." The words hit harder than she expected, because suddenly she understood this wasn't a warning. It was a prediction, a promise. "Charles believes," Mr. Whitmore continued, "that emotion entitles him to freedom. It does not. Leadership requires sacrifice." "And what are you sacrificing?" Grace whispered before she could stop herself. His silence lasted only a heartbeat, but in that moment she realized she had hit a nerve he had long buried. When he spoke again, his voice was colder. "I am offering you clarity. If you continue, whatever this is, you will step into a life that will demand more of you than you can fathom. You will be watched, Ms. Walker. You will be judged. You will be measured by metrics you cannot control, expectations you cannot influence, and history you cannot rewrite. Are you prepared for that?" The honest answer, no, flashed through her mind, but she didn't speak it. And he saw that conflict. "You are a bright woman," he said. "You know I am not your enemy. I am reality." Grace opened her mouth, but before she could reply, the door swung open again, and Charles stepped inside, his breath stilling in his chest when he saw his father standing inches from her. The temperature in the room shifted instantly, like the air had grown denser. "Dad," Charles said, voice controlled, but lined with steel she hadn't heard before. "You came here without telling me. You gave me cause to," Whitmore replied without turning. "We're done," Charles said sharply, stepping toward Grace, as if instinctively moving to shield her. "This isn't your place." "It is exactly my place," his father said. "Until you prove you can lead without letting sentiment compromise you." Grace watched in stunned silence as the two men faced each other. Mirror images distinguished only by age and conviction, bound by blood, but divided by something deeper. "You don't get to decide who I care about," Charles said, voice low and shaking, with barely contained fury. "I do," Whitmore replied. "If caring puts everything at risk, then maybe everything needs to change," Charles shot back. His father paused, and for the first time, Grace saw something shift in him. Not fear, but disappointment. So profound, It looked almost like sorrow. "Charles," he said softly, "love is not freedom. It is leverage, and leverage is something men like us pay for." With that, he turned toward the door, paused long enough to meet Grace's eyes, and said quietly, "He is not built for ordinary life, and neither are you if you choose this." Then he left, the bell chiming softly behind him, leaving the room filled with a silence so heavy it felt like gravity had doubled. Grace exhaled shakily, her mind spinning, her heart racing, her body torn between fear and anger and something dangerously close to determination. Charles turned to her, devastation etched across his features, as if terrified she'd already decided to walk away. "Grace," he whispered, stepping closer. "I didn't know he'd come. I would never let him." She held up a trembling hand, stopping him gently. "Charles, what happens now?" His answer was immediate, desperate, and honest. "Now," he said, "now I choose you, and I fight the world I was raised to obey." And for the first time, Grace understood the real battle wasn't between them and his father. It was between Charles and the life that had claimed him long before she arrived. Grace stood frozen long after Mr. Whitmore had disappeared through the door, the echo of his last sentence lingering in the quiet bookstore like a cold imprint on her skin, and she felt as if she had been simultaneously pushed into a spotlight and shoved into shadow, forced to confront a truth she wasn't prepared for. This wasn't a love story unfolding in private. It was a collision with a world that assessed her value the way investors studied risk charts. She stared at Charles, who looked both shattered and furious, in a way she hadn't seen before, his chest rising and falling with the effort it took not to sprint after his father, not to tear down whatever expectations had been built for him since childhood. But instead, he turned to her, and the look in his eyes, raw, pleading, terrified, made her heart twist painfully. He didn't move at first, as if he feared one wrong step might cause her to vanish. "Grace," he murmured, voice low with guilt and something more fragile. "I didn't know he'd do that. I swear I had no idea he would." She cut him off softly, not with anger, but with the trembling honesty she could no longer swallow. "Charles." He walked in here like he already owned the outcome. The words felt heavy on her tongue, not bitter, but laden with a grief she hadn't expected to feel. "He looked at me like I was a variable in a decision he'd already calculated." Charles flinched, his expression tightening with a pain that made her knees weaken. "You are not a variable," he said fiercely, stepping closer, "and he does not own anything about you or us." But the conviction in his voice, however desperate, couldn't erase the truth of what she'd felt under Mr. Whitmore's scrutiny, a cold certainty that caring for Charles wasn't a romantic risk. It was stepping onto a battlefield she hadn't trained for. She turned away from him, pressing her palms against the counter to steady her breathing, her mind racing in a dozen directions at once. She could still feel the chill of Mr. Whitmore's presence clinging to her skin, could still hear the unnervingly composed warning beneath his words. Choices, consequences, scrutiny, judgment. And in all of it, she sensed a terrifying undercurrent. She wasn't just being evaluated as a potential partner. She was being measured as a possible threat. "Grace, look at me," Charles pleaded gently, inching closer, but not touching her. When she finally turned, she was met with eyes so sincerely broken open that it softened something inside her, even as her chest tightened with fear. "I'm not my father," he said, his voice rough. "I don't want a life built on power plays. I don't want someone chosen for me. And I won't let him scare you away." She shook her head, not in disagreement, but because she didn't know how to hold all the emotions swirling inside her. Fear, longing, confusion, hope, love, that was growing too quickly to feel safe. You say that, she whispered, but you've spent your whole life under the weight of his expectations. You said yourself, you don't always get to choose. I'm choosing now, he insisted, stepping closer until his presence warmed her trembling frame. Grace, I've done everything he asked since I was old enough to stand. I've made every sacrifice he demanded. But this... His voice broke slightly. I won't give you up. The sincerity in his voice cracked through every defense she still held, but it also scared her more than anything his father had said. Because love like that came with weight. She didn't know if she could shoulder without losing pieces of herself along the way. She backed up a step, breath unsteady. Charles, if I stay, I'm stepping into something that could swallow me whole. He moved instinctively, catching her hand with both of his, as if afraid she might dissolve into the air. I won't let that happen. I swear I won't let him hurt you. She looked down at their hands, his fingers trembling around hers, despite how steady his voice struggled to be. This isn't about being hurt, she whispered. This is about losing myself. Charles's breath caught like she'd struck him. You won't. I won't let you. She pulled her hand from his gently, not in rejection, but because she needed space to breathe, to think, to understand where the line between them stood. You can't promise that, she said softly. Not when even you don't know what he's capable of. Pain flashed across his features, twisting his expression into something heartbreakingly vulnerable. Grace, please. Don't tell me we're ending because of him. The desperation in his voice made her throat tighten painfully. We're not ending, she said, her own voice trembling. But we're not stepping into this blind anymore. He exhaled shakily, shoulders relaxing just slightly, as though he'd been clinging to the last edge of hope. She drew a slow breath, steadying herself before speaking the truth she didn't want, but knew she needed. I need time, she said quietly. Not to decide if I care about you. I already know that. But to decide who I become next to you, and whether I'm strong enough for the world that comes with you. Charles closed his eyes briefly, as if absorbing the words like an impact, then opened them again with a tenderness so intense she had to look away for a heartbeat. Take the time, he murmured. Take whatever you need. I'll wait. I'll fight everything I have to. His voice softened. Just don't walk away from me completely. Her chest ached with a mixture of fear and longing. I'm not walking away, she whispered. I'm catching my breath. Neither of them moved for a long time, the silence stretching between them like a delicate thread, fragile, trembling, yet still unbroken. Finally, Charles stepped back, giving her something she hadn't realized. She desperately needed space without distance. I'll pick you up tonight, he said quietly. Not for anything formal, just a drive. Somewhere calm, somewhere you can breathe. She hesitated, unsure if saying yes meant stepping further into the storm or finding shelter inside it. And if I say no, she asked. His expression softened, something almost pained flickering beneath the surface. Then I'll try again tomorrow. For the first time since his father's arrival, Grace felt something warm settle beneath her ribs, not certainty, not safety, but the faint flicker of belief. All right, she whispered. Tonight. Charles's breath left him in a quiet rush, a sound that told her he had been holding on to more fear than she'd realized. He reached for her hand, but stopped inches away. Letting his fingertips hover without touching a silent question, she answered by closing the gap herself. Their hands clasped, and the warmth of his skin against hers felt like an anchor in a shifting world. Whatever happens, he whispered, you're not alone in this. Not anymore. She swallowed hard, nodding though she didn't yet trust her voice. He lifted her hand, brushing her knuckles with his lips, a gesture tender enough to fracture her remaining defenses, and then stepped back with a restraint she knew cost him. I'll see you tonight, he said softly, lingering at the door, as if leaving her meant stepping into colder air. The bell chimed as he walked out, and Grace's knees nearly gave out beneath her when the door closed. The world she had known, the quiet comfort of her ordinary life, felt impossibly distant, now replaced by the strange, heavy awareness that love, real love, came with storms she had never imagined facing. And as she stood alone in the stillness of the bookstore, Charles's father's warning echoed in her mind, but so did Charles's promise. Between them was the line she now had to cross. The question was whether she would cross it for love, or for the fear of losing it. Grace spent the rest of the afternoon haunted by a quiet tension that refused to loosen its grip every passing minute, thick with anticipation and fear, every sound in the bookstore sharpening her awareness that tonight would draw a line through her life before and after, ordinary and extraordinary, safe and uncertain, and she wasn't sure which side she truly belonged to. By the time she locked the shop and stepped out into the cool Los Angeles evening, her heartbeat felt like it had climbed into her throat. The sky glowed with the last streaks of tangerine fading into blue, the air holding that soft hum of city life settling into night, and when she saw the sleek dark car idling at the curb, her steps faltered, not because she didn't want to go, but because she had never walked willingly into something that frightened her this much. Charles stepped out the moment he saw her, not with the effortless elegance she had grown used to, but with a nervous urgency that softened him in a way she wasn't prepared for. His eyes searched her face with an almost painful need to understand whether she had changed her mind, whether her fear had hardened into distance. She didn't speak, and neither did he. Instead, she slipped into the passenger seat with a quiet breath, and he closed the door gently, like her presence alone was something precious he feared mishandling. The city blurred past them in silence, his hand steady on the wheel despite the restless glances he gave her, while she watched the reflection of streetlights dance across the windshield, feeling the weight of everything unsaid pressing between them. Finally, he turned toward the coast, driving until the city's glow softened into a quiet stretch of highway that wrapped around the ocean. He pulled over at a secluded overlook where the waves crashed far below, silvered by moonlight, and the night air was crisp enough to sting her lungs when she stepped out. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They just stood beside the car, the ocean wind tugging at their clothes, the world stretched wide and unknowable around them. When Charles finally broke the silence, his voice was low, stripped of the polished calm he used to shield himself. "Grace, I didn't bring you here to convince you. I brought you here because I needed you to see me outside all of it." She turned toward him, her heart tightening at the rawness in his eyes. He wasn't the confident heir tonight, nor the impossibly composed man she'd first approached in panic. He looked younger, unguarded, like a boy who'd grown up inside walls so high he'd forgotten what freedom felt like. "My father is already preparing meetings," he said, voice barely steady. "He'll insist I correct course. And you know what that means." Grace exhaled slowly. "Distance," she murmured. "Control," he corrected softly. "He'll frame it as protection of our reputation, of my future, but he'll be trying to dismantle everything that doesn't fit the world he built for me." She hugged her arms against the cold, but the chill she felt wasn't from the wind. "So what do you want?" she whispered. He turned fully toward her, and the answer was there instantly, without hesitation, without fear. "You," he said. "In any world, in any version of my life, you're the only thing that feels real." Her breath caught, because hearing it was both intoxicating and terrifying. He took a step closer, his voice trembling with urgency. "But wanting you isn't enough if it destroys you. I don't ever want to become someone who cages you the way my life has caged me." Grace felt something inside her break open, not in pain, but in clarity so sharp she had to steady herself. Charles, she whispered, I'm not afraid of you. I'm afraid of losing myself. Then tell me how not to make you lose yourself, he pleaded, stepping close enough for her to feel the warmth radiating from him. Tell me how to love you without hurting you. She looked up at him, the question pulling at something deep inside her, something she had avoided naming. You can't, she said gently. You can't promise that. And I can't promise I'm strong enough for everything your world will demand. His face twisted with heartbreak, but she continued before he could speak. But I can promise this. I don't want to walk away. She saw the air leave his lungs in a shaky breath, as if her words had caught him by surprise. I just need... She searched for the right words. A version of us where the world doesn't get to decide who I am or who you are. Charles stepped even closer, so close she could see the moonlight reflecting in his eyes. Then, let's build that version, he whispered, even if it means breaking the old one. Her pulse hammered. You say that, but breaking your world means defying your father. Then I'll defy him, he said simply, the certainty in his voice startling her. Grace, I've lived my whole life trying to be the man he expects. I'm tired. I'm tired of being shaped by someone else's idea of purpose. His voice cracked. You being with you is the first time I've felt like the decisions are mine. The words hit her with the force of truth, and she felt tears sting her eyes, not from fear, but from the realization that even if the world around them was dangerous, the love between them wasn't the threat. It was the anchor. She stepped toward him without thinking, her hands trembling as she placed them against his chest, feeling his heartbeat quicken beneath her palms. If we do this, she whispered, we do it together, transparent, equal, no secrets, no shields. And only if you're ready to stop living for someone else's approval. His breath faltered, and he rested his forehead against hers, voice unsteady with emotion. I'm ready if you are. She closed her eyes, letting his warmth soak into her, letting the fear and longing collide into something heavier, stronger, something that felt like destiny taking its shape. Then, yes, she breathed, I'm choosing you. His arms wrapped around her, instantly pulling her into his chest, with a sudden intensity, like he'd been holding himself back for days, and finally couldn't any longer. She melted into him, feeling the tremor in his breath, feeling his relief, feeling the quiet surrender of two people who had fought their own doubts long enough. When he kissed her, it wasn't the breathless urgency of earlier nights, nor the hesitant exploration of their first touch. It was deep anchored, a vow sealed in silence rather than words. The ocean roared below them. The moon hung like a witness in the sky. And for the first time since she stepped into his world, she didn't feel overwhelmed. She felt chosen. She felt powerful. She felt like she belonged not to his world, but to the space between them, where love made room for both their truths. When they finally pulled apart, he cupped her face gently, eyes shining with something tender and fierce. We'll face him together, he said. Your father. No, Charles whispered, brushing his thumb across her cheek. Anyone who tries to decide our future for us. She smiled, then, a small, trembling, beautiful smile that felt like the first sunrise after a long storm. Then, this is our beginning, she murmured. He nodded, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. Our real beginning. And as he held her close on the quiet stretch of coastline, the waves crashing below them like a heartbeat echoing across the night, Grace finally understood something she hadn't been able to see through. Fear. Love wasn't meant to shrink her. It was meant to make her larger, braver, capable of facing even the storms she never asked for. And beside Charles, no longer pretending, no longer hiding. She felt ready to face all of it. Together they turned back toward the city lights, not as a man pulling someone into his world, but as two people walking toward a future they would build from the ground up, hand in hand, equal in every step. The end.